The final turn of the screwdriver bit into the wood, seating the new brass numbers 72 flush against the post. Mark stepped back, a bead of sweat tracing a path from his temple down his jaw. He wiped it away with the back of his hand, leaving a faint smudge of sawdust. The mailbox, a stately black metal affair with a classic red flag, stood perfectly plumb, a small but significant monument to their new life in the Oakwood Preserve subdivision. It was solid, respectable, and, most importantly, installed. A crisp, deliberate cough came from the edge of his driveway. Mark turned. A woman stood on the pristine sidewalk, holding a clipboard like a shield. She was dressed in a beige linen pantsuit that looked immune to the humid summer air. Her blonde hair was arranged in a severe, immaculate bob. A thin, polite smile was fixed on her face, but it didn't lend any warmth to her pale blue eyes, which were methodically scanning his handiwork. "Good morning," she said, her voice as smooth and cool as polished marble. "Carol Miller. I'm the president of the Oakwood Preserve Homeowners Association." "Mark Peterson," he replied, offering a hand. "We just moved in last week. A pleasure to meet you." Carol's smile tightened as she gave his hand a brief, firm shake. Her gaze immediately returned to the mailbox. "I see you're getting settled. It's a lovely model. Very traditional." "Thanks. We thought so. Too. Just wanted to get the old, rusted one out of there as soon as possible." "Of course," she said, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on her clipboard. "I don't want to be a bother on your first weekend, but I did want to give you a friendly heads-up regarding your installation." She tilted the clipboard toward him. "As you know, all exterior modifications require prior approval from the Architectural Control Committee." Mark felt a flicker of annoyance, but kept his tone even. "Right. I remember seeing that in the documents. To be honest, I thought since it was a like-for-like replacement, just a newer version of the same thing everyone else has, it wouldn't be an issue." He gestured down the street, where a dozen nearly identical mailboxes stood sentinel in front of manicured lawns. Carol's smile did not waver, and we appreciate that consideration. The spirit of the rule is certainly about maintaining a consistent look. However, the letter of the rule is about process, and, more specifically, she paused, her finger finding a line on her paper. It's about CC&R Section 8, Subsection 4, Paragraph 2. She didn't need to read it. She had it memorized. It states that all improvements, including mail receptacles, must maintain a harmonious aesthetic with the community's pre-approved architectural style and be situated in a manner consistent with the original development plan. The committee just likes to ensure that standard is met before any permanent installation occurs. The phrasing was a masterpiece of polite, bureaucratic nonsense, harmonious aesthetic, consistent with the original plan. It could mean anything she wanted it to mean. The power dynamic was unmistakable. She wasn't a neighbor offering advice. She was an official issuing a warning. "So, what does this mean?" Mark asked, his brief pride in his work already curdling into unease. "Do I need to submit a form after the fact?" "That would be the best course of action," Carol said, her pen already clicking. "Just a simple ACC request form. You can find it on the community portal. Describe the make and model of the box and the materials of the post. The committee meets on the first Tuesday of every month. In the meantime, this is just a courtesy notice." She tore a slip of paper from a pad on her clipboard and handed it to him. It was thick, creamy cardstock, professionally printed with the HOA logo. Just a reminder of the relevant covenant. No fines, no violations filed. Just a friendly welcome to the neighborhood and our procedures. She gave him another one of her bloodless smiles, made a neat check mark on her sheet, and turned, her sensible heels clicking softly on the concrete as she continued her patrol. Mark stood there for a long moment, the courtesy notice feeling heavier than it should in his hand. He looked from the perfectly installed mailbox to Carol's retreating back. This wasn't a welcome. It was the opening move in a game he didn't yet understand. That evening, the aroma of garlic and basil filled their new kitchen, a comforting scent that failed to completely dispel the day's lingering tension. Sarah, his wife, expertly swirled pasta in a pot while keeping one eye on their 7-year-old daughter. Lily, who was meticulously coloring at the breakfast nook. "So, the queen of the cul-de-sac paid you a visit," Sarah said, her tone light. Mark had recounted the exchange a few hours earlier. "The president?" "Yes," Mark corrected, pulling a thick 3-ring binder from a box of files labeled House Closing Docs. "Carol Miller. She had the charisma of an IRS audit." He flipped through the tabs until he found the one marked CC&Rs. He located the section she had quoted from memory. There it was, CAR 8.4.2. Sarah came over, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and leaned over his shoulder to read the dense paragraph. "Harmonious aesthetic," she read aloud, a note of amusement in her voice. She took a yellow highlighter from a drawer and drew a neat line under the phrase. "This one seems a little vague. Let's hope that doesn't become an issue." "Tell me about it," Mark sighed, scanning the rest of the page. She said it also had to be consistent with the original development plan. What does that even mean? His eyes fell on another document tucked into the same section of the binder, the official plat map from their property survey. A large, folded sheet of paper covered in precise black lines and measurements. He unfolded it across the table, the crisp paper crinkling. Their lot. 47 was clearly delineated. He traced the property lines with his finger. His accountant's brain appreciated the certainty of it, the neat angles and absolute numbers. "Here's the development plan, I guess," he said. He pointed to a cross-hatched section running along the front of their property, encompassing the sidewalk and a 5-foot strip of their lawn. The key at the bottom labeled it PUE, Public Utility Easement. "Look at that. The whole area where the mailbox is. It's a county easement for power lines, water mains, that sort of thing." "So, the county owns it?" Sarah asked, stirring the sauce. "Not exactly. We own it, but the county has the right to access it for maintenance. We can't build anything permanent on it." He tapped the map. "Good to know where we can't build a shed someday." He folded the plat map carefully and slipped it back into its plastic sleeve behind the CC&Rs. The courtesy notice from Carol still lay on the counter, a stark white rectangle against the warm butcher block. He picked it up and filed it away in the binder as well. For now, it was just a piece of paper. Their conversation shifted to more important matters. Lily's upcoming series of appointments with the specialist in the city. The procedure wasn't major, but it wasn't cheap either. They had sunk nearly all their savings into the down payment on this house, banking on a few years of stability and Mark's steady project manager salary to rebuild their nest egg. This home, this quiet street, was supposed to be their sanctuary, a place where the only thing they needed to worry about was Lily's health and happiness. "Don't worry about her," Sarah said, as if reading his mind. She brushed a stray piece of hair from his forehead. "We'll fill out the form tomorrow. It's a silly bureaucratic hoop. That's all. In a month. We'll be laughing about the welcome wagon with a clipboard." Mark nodded, wanting to believe her. But as he looked at the thick binder, a repository of rules and regulations that governed every shingle, every fence post, every blade of grass, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The house was their dream. But it was a dream built on land ruled by others. And Queen Carol had just made it clear she was watching their every move. A week later, Any hope that the mailbox issue was a minor bureaucratic hurdle evaporated. The mail carrier, a cheerful man named Dave, didn't just put the mail in their new box. He walked it up to the door. "Got a certified one for you, Mr. Peterson," he said, holding out a stiff green and white envelope and a digital scanner. Mark's stomach tightened. He signed the screen, his signature a jagged line. "Thanks, Dave." He closed the door, the envelope feeling cold in his hand. It was from the Oakwood Preserve HOA, care of a management company called Aspen Community Management. He tore it open with a sense of dread. Inside was not a friendly approval of his retroactively filed form. It was a document titled Formal Notice of Violation. His eyes scanned the text. It was printed on the same heavy, expensive-feeling paper as the courtesy notice. It cited, once again, CC&R for 8.4.2. It stated that his mailbox, deemed an unapproved modification, was in violation. His ACC request, it noted, had been reviewed and denied due to failure to conform to the harmonious aesthetic outlined in the community's architectural guidelines. The words were infuriatingly vague, but the numbers were not. Violation, unapproved exterior, modification mail, receptacle, fine assessed, $100. Cure period, 14 days from the date of this notice. Failure to cure the violation will result in additional fines and may lead to further enforcement action by the association. $100 for a mailbox that looked exactly like 20 others on their street. This wasn't a hoop to jump through. This was a shakedown. Sarah's words from a week ago echoed in his mind. Let's hope that doesn't become an issue. He looked out the window at the mailbox, standing proud and solid at the end of his driveway. It no longer looked like a symbol of their new life. It looked like a target. Carol Miller wasn't making a suggestion. And this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the start of a formal, bureaucratic fight. And he had the certified mail receipt to prove it. The Architectural Control Committee meeting was held in a soulless, beige-walled room in the community clubhouse. The air was stale with the scent of industrial carpet cleaner and weak coffee. Mark sat at a long folding table opposite three figures who sat like judges at a tribunal. Carol Miller was in the center, flanked by two other board members, a severe-looking woman with tightly permed hair named Eleanor Vance, and a man named Gary, whose bland, agreeable face seemed incapable of independent thought. Mark had his binder open in front of him, tabbed and ready. He had prepared a calm, logical appeal. "Thank you for seeing me," he began, keeping his voice steady. "I'm here about the violation notice regarding my mailbox at 72 Willow Creek Drive. As you can see from these photographs." He slid a series of 8x10 prints across the table. "My mailbox is a standard, widely available model that is functionally and aesthetically identical to the mailboxes at numbers 68, 74, 80, and 85 Willow Creek, as well as several on Oak Street. My request is simply that the committee apply the harmonious aesthetic standard consistently." Carol picked up a photo, examining it as if it were a complex piece of art. "Mr. Peterson, the committee appreciates your thoroughness. However, harmonious aesthetic is not merely about superficial similarity." Eleanor Vance chimed in, her voice thin and sharp. "It's about the overall presentation. The post on your receptacle, for instance, it's cedar. The original development specified pressure-treated pine, painted black." "The post at 80 Willow Creek is also cedar," Mark countered, tapping the relevant photo. "And it's unpainted. Is that homeowner also in violation?" Carol set the photo down and folded her hands. The look she gave him was one of polite pity, as if he were a child who simply couldn't grasp a difficult concept. "The board addresses each property on a case-by-case basis. We are not here to discuss other properties. We are here to discuss yours. Your application was denied because the combination of the specific mailbox model you chose with the unapproved post material creates an aesthetic that the committee, in its discretion, has determined is not harmonious with the established community standard. It was circular logic, a fortress of subjectivity. Her power didn't come from the rules themselves, but from her exclusive right to interpret them. Gary, the third member, just nodded along, his eyes glazed over. "So my only option is to tear it out and replace it?" Mark asked, a new edge to his voice. "You have 14 days to cure the violation," Carol said smoothly. "That would be the most direct path to compliance. Of course, you are welcome to submit a new application with a different post material for the committee's consideration at next month's meeting." By which time, he would have accrued another month of fines. Mark felt a surge of frustration. He was a project manager. He dealt in plans, budgets, and concrete deliverables. This was the opposite, a system of arbitrary power, wielded with a smile. "I'd like the committee's vote on my appeal to be recorded in the minutes, please," Mark said, his voice colder now. Carol's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course. All in favor of upholding the violation notices issued." She and Eleanor raised their hands instantly. Gary, startled into action, quickly raised his as well. And opposed. Mark stared at them. They were waiting for him. "I'm not on the committee," he said. "Oh, of course," Carol said, feigning embarrassment. "Silly me." The motion passes, 2-0, with one abstention. She looked at Gary, who quickly lowered his hand and adopted an expression of deep thought, as if he had been abstaining all along. Her control was absolute. "The decision of the committee is to deny the appeal," she announced. "The fine stands, and the 14-day cure period remains in effect. Thank you for your time, Mr. Peterson. The minutes will reflect your appeal was heard." Mark packed his photos and his binder, his hands stiff with anger. He had walked in hoping for reason, and had been met with a polite, procedural stonewall. As he left the clubhouse, the evening sun cast long shadows across the perfect lawns. He now knew this wasn't just about a mailbox. It was about submission, and he was not the submissive type. The fines would continue, and he was going to have to find a different way to fight back. The next 2 weeks were a blur of quiet, methodical anger. Mark channeled his frustration into investigation, spending his evenings after Lily was in bed, transformed into a reluctant suburban detective. He started by walking the neighborhood, not for leisure, but for reconnaissance. With a notebook and his phone's camera, he documented every mailbox, every fence, every lawn ornament in Oakwood Preserve. A pattern quickly emerged. The identical cedar post that was the source of his violation existed on at least 5 other properties, all of which had been there for years. A particular style of non-compliant fence was common, but only 3 homeowners had been cited for it. The common thread seemed to be Carol. The homeowners who served on her various committees, or were in her social circle, had identical violations that went completely ignored. The ones who kept to themselves, or worse, had previously questioned her authority at an annual meeting, were ticketed for the slightest infraction. His next step was to formalize his findings. He sent a polite but firm email to Aspen Community Management, officially requesting copies of the HOA's meeting minutes for the past 2 years. As was his right under the state's Property Owner Association Act, he wanted to see the voting records, the fine assessments, the vendor contracts. A week later, a thick manila envelope arrived. Mark tore it open eagerly in his home office. Inside was a stack of paper nearly an inch thick. But as he started to read, his eagerness turned to cold fury. Huge sections of the documents were blacked out with a thick, dark marker, Entire pages were redacted, with only the meeting date and adjournment time visible. The sections detailing financial approvals, vendor contract votes, and fine adjudications were almost entirely illegible. A cover letter from the management company cited attorney-client privilege and protection of confidential homeowner information as the reason for the redactions. It was a transparent cover-up. What was Carol hiding? Feeling like he was hitting a wall, Mark remembered a conversation he'd had with a neighbor, a friendly older man who was always working in his garage. He had mentioned he'd served on the board years ago, before the current regime took over. He found Mr. Henderson in his garage, surrounded by the organized clutter of a lifelong tinkerer. The air smelled of sawdust and oil. Mark introduced himself and explained his situation. Mr. Henderson, a man with kind eyes and work-worn hands, listened patiently, nodding as Mark laid out the story of the mailbox, the inconsistent enforcement, and the redacted minutes. Carol Miller, Henderson said, wiping his hands on a rag. His voice was gravelly. Took over the board about 5 years back. Very ambitious. Thinks she's running a corporation, not a neighborhood. He sighed. I stepped down not long after. Life's too short for that kind of politics. I'm trying to fight a fine, but I feel like I'm shadowboxing, Mark confessed. They claim my mailbox post isn't compliant, but they ignore others. They deny my appeals and send me minutes that look like classified government documents. Henderson's eyes lit up with interest. Redacted minutes. That's a new one. She's getting bold. What was the violation? Exactly. CC&R 8.4.2, Mark said. Something about harmonious aesthetic and being consistent with the original development plan. Henderson let out a low whistle. Ah, the aesthetics clause. The tyrant's favorite tool. Vague enough to mean whatever she wants. He stroked his chin. You mentioned the original development plan. Did you happen to look at the plat map for your property? Mark's mind flashed back to that first evening, unfolding the large survey map on his kitchen table. Yes, I have it. I noticed the front of my lawn is on a public utility easement. Mr. Henderson stopped polishing a piece of wood and looked at Mark, his expression sharp and focused. Bring it to me, he said. And the CC&Rs. Let's have a look at what those documents really say. Mark retrieved the binder from his house. He and Henderson spread the plat map and the governing documents across a large workbench. Henderson, a retired surveyor, moved his finger across the map with an expert's familiarity. There it is, he said, tapping the cross-hatched area on Mark's lot. PUE, the HOA's architectural standards, as defined in Article 8 of your CC&Rs, apply to the privately owned lots and the common areas. He then pointed to a different section of the covenants. But Article 2, Section 2.3 explicitly excludes areas subject to public easements from the definition of common area that the HOA maintains and controls. And your private lot's architectural restrictions don't typically supersede a public right-of-way. The HOA can't tell you what to do on land they don't have jurisdiction over. The county, and only the county, can regulate what's built on that easement. Mark stared at the map, then at the dense text of the covenants. It was a technicality, a piece of bureaucratic jargon he had glanced at and filed away. But Henderson was right. It was a loophole, a fatal flaw in Carol's case. She has no authority, Mark said, the realization dawning on him. The entire violation is based on a location she doesn't govern. Bingo, Henderson said with a grim smile. She's either incompetent, or she's counting on nobody ever reading the fine print. He looked at Mark thoughtfully. But why you? You're new. Why go to all this trouble to target you right out of the gate? He paused. a flicker of memory in his eyes. Peterson, you said your name was... Where did you work before you moved here? I was a senior project manager for Northgate Development, over in the city, Mark replied. Henderson's face changed. The friendly curiosity was replaced by a look of sudden, startling clarity. Northgate, he said softly. Of course. What is it? Carol's maiden name was Ricci. Her father and uncle ran Ricci and Sons Construction. It was a big local firm for decades. About 10 years ago, they bid on a major municipal contract, the new Civic Center project. They were the favorites to win it, had the inside track. But at the last minute, the city awarded the contract to an outside firm, Northgate Development. The name hit Mark like a physical blow. He remembered the project. It had been one of his first big assignments. Ricci and Sons couldn't absorb the loss. Henderson continued, his voice low. They had overextended. Counting on that contract, they went bankrupt within a year. It was a huge local story. The family lost everything. Carol took it very, very hard. Mark felt the air leave his lungs. It wasn't about a mailbox. It had never been about a mailbox. It wasn't even just about power. It was a decade-old grudge, a personal vendetta against the company he used to work for, projected onto him. Carol wasn't just a tyrant. She was a woman seeking revenge, and he had just planted a flag on her battlefield. Armed with the jurisdictional bombshell and the understanding of Carol's personal motive, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was no longer just a defensive battle. It was time to go on the offensive. He spent a weekend drafting a formal, meticulously researched letter. He cited the specific articles of the CC&Rs, quoted the definition of common area, and attached a highlighted copy of his plat map, clearly showing the public utility easement. He laid out the argument with the dispassionate logic of a legal brief. The HOA had no jurisdiction over the land where his mailbox sat, and therefore, the violation and all associated fines were null and void. He concluded with a demand for the immediate dismissal of the violation and a full refund of the fine he had not yet paid. He sent the letter via certified mail to the HOA board, care of Aspen Community Management. He expected a grudging letter of retreat. What he got was a quiet, menacing escalation. 2 evenings later, as he and Sarah were cleaning up after dinner, the doorbell rang. Standing on their porch were 2 police officers. "Good evening, sir," the older officer said, his hand resting near his sidearm. "We received a call requesting a welfare check at this address. Is everything all right here?" Mark's mind raced. A welfare check from who everything is fine. The call was anonymous. "Sir, a neighbor reported sounds of a serious domestic disturbance," the officer said, his eyes scanning the space behind Mark. "Into their home." Sarah appeared at Mark's shoulder, her face a mask of confusion and fear. Lily peeked out from behind her mother's legs. "There's been no disturbance," Mark said, his voice hard. "My wife and I were washing dishes. My daughter is getting ready for bed." The officers exchanged a look. It wasn't an aggressive look, but it was one of assessment. This wasn't a standard patrol car. This felt different. One of Carol's board cronies, Eleanor Vance, had a nephew in the local police department. The connection clicked into place with sickening certainty. This wasn't an official action. It was a message. We can bring the authorities to your door. We can disrupt your life. We can frighten your family. After a few more questions, the officers seemed satisfied that the call was a hoax and left, their apologies sounding hollow. But the damage was done. Sarah was shaken, and Lily was scared by the sight of policemen at their door. The sanctity of their home had been violated. The next day, the HOA's official response arrived, again by certified mail. It was a notice of hearing and intent to file lien. The letter was breathtaking in its audacity. It completely ignored the jurisdictional evidence he had presented. It stated that because the fines, which had now escalated to $950, including late fees and administrative charges, remained unpaid, the association was exercising its right to seek a lien on their property. It scheduled a final hearing before the executive board in 2 weeks' time, an open forum where he would be given an opportunity to present his case before the board made its final ruling. The lien was the ultimate threat. It was a legal claim against their house, a black mark on their title that would prevent them from selling or refinancing until the debt was paid. They had weaponized the bureaucracy to threaten the single greatest asset his family had. The welfare check was the subtle intimidation. This was the formal declaration of war. The public hearing would be his one and only chance to stop them. And he knew Carol would stack the deck against him. The community center meeting room was packed, the air thick with a mixture of stale air conditioning, cheap coffee, and palpable tension. Homeowners filled the plastic chairs, a mix of curious onlookers, disgruntled residents, and Carol's loyal supporters. At the front of the room, behind a long table, sat the 5-member executive board. Carol was in the center, flanked by Eleanor Vance and Gary, her reliable votes. The other 2 members, a quiet man named David Chen and a woman named Maria Flores, looked deeply uncomfortable. A large digital clock was projected onto the screen behind them, next to the agenda item Homeowner Forum. The time allocated for each speaker was displayed in stark red numbers 5:00. Mark sat in the front row, his hands resting on the worn leather of his binder. Sarah sat beside him, her hand gripping his. She had spent the last 2 nights helping him distill his case into a clear, concise, and devastating presentation. He had practiced it over and over, timing himself, refining every word. He had also made a final, unsettling discovery. While reviewing the unredacted portions of the HOA's financial statements, he'd noticed that one vendor was receiving unusually large and frequent payments, Greenscape Solutions, a landscaping company. The payments were for vague services like common area enhancement and seasonal planting. Mr. Henderson had made a few calls. It turned out Greenscape was owned by Carol's brother-in-law. It was a clear-cut kickback scheme. As he was preparing to add this bombshell to his presentation, he saw Mrs. Gable shuffle into the room. She was a sweet, elderly widow who lived down the street on a fixed income. Carol had been targeting her for months over a small collection of ceramic garden gnomes, fining her into near poverty. Mark's fight had become, in part, for people like her. But as Mrs. Gable sat down, her son, a young man named Tom, sat beside her. Mark felt a jolt of recognition. Tom Gable was the man he'd seen driving the Greenscape Solutions truck. He had taken the job out of desperation after being laid off from his factory position. The moral dilemma was a physical weight in Mark's chest. He had the evidence to expose Carol's corruption completely, to destroy her. But doing so would implicate Tom Gable, a desperate man trying to support his widowed mother, and would bring shame and potential legal trouble upon the very person he was trying to protect. He looked at Mrs. Gable's worried face. He couldn't do it. He would have to win on the merits of his own case, leaving the corruption for another day. His victory had to be clean. Next speaker, Mark Peterson, 72 Willow Creek Drive. The secretary announced. The clock on the screen reset to 5:00. It started counting down the second he stood up. Mark walked to the podium, placed his binder on it, and looked out at the board, then at the assembled homeowners. He took a deep breath. "Good evening, members of the board and neighbors." His voice was calm, steady. "My name is Mark Peterson. I am here tonight to appeal a fine of $950, and a pending lien on my property for an alleged violation of CC&R, Section 8.4.2, regarding my mailbox. 445. The board's position is that my mailbox violates the harmonious aesthetic of the community. I would like to present 4 pieces of evidence to refute this claim and to demonstrate that this entire action is invalid. He held up a packet of documents he'd prepared for the board and handed a copy to the secretary to distribute. First, he said, his voice gaining strength, the board has cited Section 8.4.2, a subjective clause that grants the ACC broad, discretionary power that, as my second piece of evidence shows, has been applied selectively and unfairly. He clicked a remote, and the projector screen behind the board lit up with a slideshow. It showed his mailbox, followed by pictures of the 5 other mailboxes with identical, non-compliant cedar posts. These homeowners have never been fined. This is not enforcement. It is targeted harassment. 358. A murmur went through the crowd. Third, he continued, clicking to the next slide, which showed a page of the heavily redacted minutes he had received. This is a page from the minutes of the ACC meeting, where my initial appeal was denied. As you can see, the justification for the board's decisions, along with all financial matters, has been blacked out, citing attorney-client privilege. This is a deliberate denial of a homeowner's right to transparency, in direct violation of state law. 310. The murmur grew louder. David Chen and Maria Flores were studying their packets with intense focus, avoiding eye contact with Carol. Which brings me to my final and most important point, Mark said, his voice ringing with conviction. The first 3 points are irrelevant. The fines, the hearings, the lien, all of it is moot. The entire issue is based on a fundamental misinterpretation of the association's authority. He clicked to his final slide. It was a high-resolution image of his plat map. The public utility easement, highlighted in bright yellow. This is the official, county-recorded plat map for my property. As you can see, the area where my mailbox is located sits on a 5-foot public utility easement, according to our own CC&Rs. Article 2, Section 2.3 public easements are explicitly excluded from the areas governed by this association's architectural standards. 220. He let the statement hang in the air. The room was silent. He could see the other board members frantically flipping through their copies of the covenants. He saw the precise moment David Chen found the clause. His eyes widened. The Oakwood Preserve HOA has no jurisdiction over my mailbox, Mark declared, looking directly at Carol. It never has. This entire process, from the first notice to the threat of a lien against my family's home, has been an illegal overreach of your authority. He saw it then, for a fraction of a second, beneath the mask of polite control, a flicker of pure, unadulterated fear in Carol Miller's eyes. It was the look of a tyrant who had just realized her throne was built on sand. She quickly composed herself, her face hardening into a mask of indignation. But the moment had happened. Everyone saw it. I am not here tonight to ask for your leniency, Mark concluded. As the clock ticked below 1 minute, I am here to respectfully inform you of the facts. I demand that you vote to immediately dismiss this violation, cancel all fines, and rescind the notice of intent to lien. Thank you. He walked back to his seat, his heart hammering against his ribs. The clock on the screen read 0:47. The silence in the room lasted for 3 seconds before it shattered. A wave of angry, excited chatter swept through the homeowners. People were on their feet, pointing at the screen, talking to their neighbors. It was an uproar. At the board table, chaos reigned. David Chen was speaking rapidly to Maria Flores, pointing to the plat map in his packet, and then to his copy of the CCNRs. Gary looked utterly lost, swiveling his head between Carol and the angry crowd. Eleanor Vance was whispering furiously in Carol's ear. But Carol's authority had evaporated. David Chen held up his hand for silence, then stood. "Mr. Peterson." "Thank you," he said, his voice clear and firm. He looked not at Mark, but at his fellow board members. "The evidence presented is compelling. In light of the clear jurisdictional boundaries outlined in the governing documents and on the official plat map, I move to immediately dismiss violation Newer 734 against Lot 47 and to rescind any and all fines and pending legal actions associated with it." "I second that motion," Maria Flores said immediately, her voice full of indignation. Carol's face was a thundercloud. "This is highly irregular," she snapped. "This requires further review by our legal counsel." "No, it doesn't," David retorted, his quiet demeanor gone, replaced by a cold anger. "It requires us to read our own governing documents, all in favor of dismissing the violations." He and Maria raised their hands, after a moment of panicked indecision. Gary, seeing the tide had turned so violently, slowly raised his. Eleanor and Carol sat with their hands on the table, their knuckles white. "The motion carries, 3-2. David announced, "The violation is dismissed." A smattering of applause broke out in the audience. A representative from Aspen Community Management, a young man in an ill-fitting suit who had been sitting quietly in the corner, looked utterly horrified, no doubt contemplating the massive legal exposure Carol had just created for his company. But David Chen wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he said, his voice rising over the noise, "given the evidence of selective enforcement and the disturbing lack of transparency in the association's records, I move that the board commission a full, independent audit of all ACC decisions and financial accounts for the past 24 months. "Seconded," Maria called out. "And I move," she added, standing up to face the room, "that we table a motion of censure against President Miller for gross malfeasance and deliberate overreach of authority, pending the results of that audit." The room erupted. Carol Miller, President and Queen of Oakwood Preserve, sat frozen, her face ashen, as her meticulously constructed kingdom crumbled around her. Mark reached for Sarah's hand. It was over. He had fought the bureaucracy not with anger, but with its own rules. And he had won. Weeks later, the dust had settled, leaving a dramatically altered landscape in Oakwood Preserve. Carol Miller had resigned from the board effective immediately, citing personal reasons. The independent audit had been launched, and its preliminary findings had already resulted in the termination of the HOA's contract with Aspen Community Management and the landscaping firm Greenscape Solutions. A special election was held, and both David Chen and Maria Flores were re-elected, joined by 3 new members, including a reluctant but resolute Mr. Henderson. Mark, now seen as a quiet hero in the community, found himself an active participant in the neighborhood's restoration. At the new board's first town hall, he stood not at a plaintiff's podium, but at the main lectern, proposing a transparency and fair enforcement policy. The bylaw amendment, which he had drafted with Mr. Henderson, required all ACC decisions to be justified in writing with specific, non-subjective criteria, mandated that all meeting minutes be published online without redaction, and established a clear, simple appeals process overseen by an independent homeowner ombudsman. It passed with a unanimous vote and a standing ovation. One crisp autumn afternoon, Mark was raking leaves near his mailbox, his perfectly legal, non-compliant, jurisdiction-free mailbox, when the mail carrier handed him the day's delivery. Tucked among the bills and catalogs was a simple, white envelope, with his name and address written in a neat, elegant script. There was no return address. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet of stationery. The letter was from Carol. Mr. Peterson, it has come to my attention that my understanding of your professional history was inaccurate. I had been under the impression that you were part of the executive team at Northgate Development, responsible for the Civic Center bid. I have since learned you were a junior project manager at the time and had no involvement in that process. I trust you and your family are enjoying your home. Sincerely, Carol Miller. It wasn't an apology. It didn't admit fault or express remorse for the stress and fear she had caused his family. But it was something more complex, a confession, a stark admission that her entire vendetta, the source of her targeted campaign, was based on a complete and utter misunderstanding. It was a small, quiet, and deeply human end to a battle that had felt so monumental. It provided a sense of closure without excusing her actions. Mark folded the letter and put it in his pocket. He looked at his house, where a light had just come on in the kitchen window. He could see the silhouettes of Sarah and Lily inside, safe and secure. The battle had been long and exhausting, but the peace that followed was worth every fight. Their home was finally, truly, their own